Hi everybody, welcome to session 2 of the Way Virtual Easter Retreat. For session 2, we're going to be in Colossians chapter 1 verses 15 through 23, so if you want to go ahead and open up and turn there. And remember, before you go through with the rest of this video, your assignment is to read beforehand, so you can kind of investigate, ask questions, observe the text before we do this lesson together. So remember, you can't start a first-hand encounter by just looking at secondary sources. You've got to go right there, so read first. Okay, right off the bat, before we start this session, I want to say this. I'm going to be inadequate to preach and teach this text that we're looking at today. It's just one of those texts that's so lofty, it's so glorious, it's so poetic and wonderful that I don't think anything I can say in this 15 or 20 minute video can move you emotionally the way this is supposed to move you emotionally, okay? I can't do it. I don't think any sermon can do this. We need like a work of art or a poem or a song to do justice to this song. But a sermon or a teaching session is what we have for now, so here we go. All right, let's read Colossians chapter 1, starting in verse 15. It says, "He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. And you, who were once alienated and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds, he has now reconciled in the body of his flesh by his death, in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before him. If indeed you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you heard, which has been proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and of which I, Paul, became a minister." Okay, so let's connect this text to yesterday a little bit. If you remember right, at the very end of yesterday, we were reading verses 13 and 14. He has delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us into the kingdom of his beloved Son. So we've been taken out of this kingdom of darkness into this new kingdom to live under this new king. And then Paul just goes off on a tangent. Your new king, let me tell you about him. Maybe your translation doesn't reflect it. Mine doesn't. My translation splits the paragraphs, but in Greek, this is all one big sentence. Your new king, who, comma, ... And then in that next group of verses, Paul is telling us about the new king. He's unpacking who this new king is. He's going to tell us about the Son, okay? So, all of this passage, Paul is unpacking who is Jesus, who is the Son, who is our king. And mainly, he has two things to say. First off, Jesus is the Lord of creation. We're going to see that in the first half of this text. And then he's the Lord of the new creation. We're going to see that in the second half. So Jesus is the Lord of creation. Jesus is the Lord of the new creation. Let's dive into that. First off, look at verses 15 through 17. Now let's read those again. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. Stop there. Okay. If you've been in church much, you have probably heard this passage from Colossians 1 taught before. It's one of the most famous Christological passages in the New Testament. Christology is the study of Christ. So John chapter 1, Colossians chapter 1, Hebrews chapter 1. It's funny how the Christology always comes right at the beginning of the book, right? Anyway, this is one of those famous Christological passages where we as the church get to understand who Jesus is and the true nature of his humanity and his divinity. But I think sometimes I'm worried that our familiarity with these passages can cause us just to run right through them, to pass over them, and not really feel the emotional weight that we're supposed to feel when we read a passage like this. It doesn't strike us the way it would have struck the original audience. Like we've been doing, we're going to do another thought experiment. And we're going to try to see what this text would have felt like to somebody in the first century. So pick a historical figure. Think of someone in recent history, past 100 years or so, who's maybe a moral leader and started a movement and was very widely respected. So I'm going to go with Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. King. Okay? So now imagine that there's a group running around who is starting a new religion saying that Martin Luther King Jr. is their savior. Okay? Kind of strange, we might think. It might be weird if there are people running around like Martin Luther King is the savior of humanity. A little weird. But there's more than that. Not just is Martin Luther King Jr. the savior of humanity, he's actually God. He's God in the flesh. This man who lived 60 years ago was God in the very flesh. Okay, now this is starting to get really crazy. But wait, there's more. Not only is he the savior, not only is he God in the flesh, he also upholds the entire universe and is currently holding it together at this moment so the universe doesn't disintegrate and snap out of existence. Okay, Martin Luther King Jr. is the savior, he's God, he upholds the universe. Little strange, huh? To be saying that about somebody who just 60 years ago was widely respected, who was a great teacher, who was extremely revered. But that is what is going on in the first century, okay? Paul is writing maybe 20, maybe 25, maybe 30 years after the death of Jesus at our best guess. Here's a guy who people currently walking around can remember seeing him and being around him. And you have this religion, this group spreading throughout the world saying he's the savior of humanity. He is God in the flesh. He rose from the dead. He defeated death. And he upholds the universe. This would be crazy. This would be striking. This would hit us like a ton of bricks, okay? But I really think for these Christians, as crazy as these claims were, they were the only way to do justice to who Jesus was. They were the only way that they could fathom understanding who this man was, because he wasn't a mere man. Okay. Let's dive all the way in and break down what Paul says. Let's study his language a little bit. First off, verse 15. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. So, image of God, what does that language remind you of? That should take you back to Genesis 1 again, right? We were there yesterday. Genesis 1, God says, let us make humanity in our image. We are made in the image of God. We're supposed to be a representation of God. But do you think if anybody looked at us, they would get a decent representation of God? I think if people looked at the current state of humanity, they would get a pretty tarnished idea of who God is. That'd be a distortion. That'd be a twist. We're not an accurate representation because of sin, because of the fall. But then what does Jesus do? He comes as the perfect image of God. He actually looks like God. Look at Jesus and you see what God is really like. He's loving, he's caring, he's perfect, holy, just, and he's self-sacrificing. So everything Jesus is, everything we see in him, that's what God is like. Jesus is the clearest picture we will ever get on this earth of what God himself is like, of God's character, of his heart, of how he feels about us. The book of John says it like this: no one has ever seen God, but the only one who is at the Father's side, he has made him known. No one has ever seen God, but Christ has made him known. Let's keep going. He's the firstborn over all creation. That's what it says in the second part of verse 15. Firstborn of all creation. So Paul's not trying to say that Jesus was born, like as in he was created by God. Jesus is uncreated. But he is trying to say that Jesus exists before all of creation. He existed before there was anything else. And also, in Hebrew and ancient culture, firstborn would be recognized as a title. It's like a rank, okay? So for the Hebrews, the firstborn son would always receive a double portion of inheritance when the father died. And then if the father had like a business or a title, or maybe he was the head of a clan or a tribe, or he was royalty, whatever title that father had, whatever business, whatever leadership, if he was a king, that passes to the firstborn. He's the inheritor of the father's title, of his rank, of his rule. So this is what Jesus is. He is the full heir to the universe. He's the heir who's going to receive rule from the Father over all things. He's the heir to the universe that God is creating. Let's keep going. This is verse 16 now. For by him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, thrones, dominions, rulers, authorities. All things were created through him and for him. Okay, so not only is Jesus at work in creation with the Father, he's the goal of creation. All right? If history is a story, you're not the main character. I'm not the main character. Jesus Christ is the main character. God wrote the story and he said, here, my son, you're the main character. You're who it's all for. It's all about you. Your life is the climax. He's the point that history has been building towards, his life, death, resurrection. And now history is building towards his return. Okay, and then last of all there, it says all things were created, not just through him, for him. Okay? He is before all things. In him all things hold together. So God is not a passive God who creates the universe, winds it up, and kind of lets it go and lets it run its course on its own, okay? That's not the kind of God he is. He is a hands-on God. God is actively governing, upholding, sustaining the universe. He's in charge. All right, so Jesus is God in the flesh. This man who lived and died, he is the creator, sustainer, main character of the universe. Creation is by him and it's created for him. Okay, before we move on to this next part of the passage, let me pause. Why did Paul write all this? Okay, maybe a good question. Why was he trying to communicate this stuff about Christ to the Colossians? So for a long time, many scholars and pastors have thought that there must have been some sort of false teaching run around at Colossae. But this question is pretty hairy, okay? Was it Gnosticism maybe? That used to be the main idea, but lately, all the scholars that I've read for this study are saying that Gnosticism is out, okay? Gnosticism doesn't really fit the historical timeline right, and especially it really doesn't fit all the warnings that Paul's going to give in chapter 2. So lately you hear more speculation, scholars asking maybe it's some sort of mystical form of Judaism. That fits a little better with the details later on in the book. But ultimately, we're just going to leave it at that, okay? If you're really interested in exegetical questions like this, I'd love to go deep with you and have that conversation. It's fun. It does matter. But I also want to push back against this. I want to push back against the idea that this passage is only important. It only exists to refute some specific heresy, okay? This passage is so much bigger than that, all right? Here we are. Paul is tying together the history of the universe, the history of the human race, the eternal destiny of humans and the whole universe. And we're going to act like the only thing this is important for is refuting some first century heresy? That's ridiculous. So no matter what's going on in Colossae, this is important because it's about who Jesus is. Okay, I wanted to get that out of the way before we get too lost in the weeds of uncovering the Colossian heresy or something like that. So if you want to know more, let's talk about it later. But right now, let's move on. Okay, Christ is the Lord of creation. Now it's time for the second half of this passage. Christ is the Lord of the new creation. Let's read verses 18 through 20. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. Okay, so verse 18 is saying he's the head of the church, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. So you might notice a parallel from before. Earlier we had he's the firstborn of all creation. Here we have he is the firstborn from the dead. There's a parallelism here. The first passage, he's the Lord of creation, and now he's the Lord of new creation. He's the first thing in this new act. He's the first chapter of this new story that God is writing. Okay? He started the universe and he reigns over it, and now that the time has come to redeem the universe, he's starting that too. And also, the word firstborn means that there's more to come. God's going to do some more resurrecting. God has started a renovation project in the universe, but he's not finished. There's a new creation coming. Okay? Let's look on to verse 19 and 20. In him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. All the fullness of God. In this man who lived 30 years ago, all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. And don't just notice all the fullness of God. Notice the word pleased. He was pleased to do it. God was happy to step down into this universe and take up residence in this man, Jesus Christ. Why? Because that's who he is. Like we said, Jesus is the image of God. He's God's billboard telling you, This is what I'm like. I'm willing to be with you. I'm willing to suffer for you. I'm willing to die for you. Okay, last part now, verses 21 through 23. We were alienated and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds. He has now reconciled us in his body of flesh by his death, in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before him, if indeed you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast. Look at that first part. We were alienated and hostile in mind. We weren't just bored with God or ignorant about him or kind of like just meh. We were actively hostile. We were in open rebellion. And in that state, he came to rescue us. For Jesus, the idea of loving your enemies wasn't just some like lofty ideal that kind of sounded good when he said it. It was really just his life story, all right? So Jesus is the Lord of creation. He was there in the beginning, shaping the universe, and now he is the Lord of this new creation. He's the one who lived, died, and rose to recreate, to redeem, to remake fallen mankind. Wow, this is an awesome passage. I want to close today by reading you a parable I wrote when I was studying this passage. There was an artist who was renowned around the world for his stunning paintings. They were greatly prized, sought after by museums from Paris to Tokyo. The artist painted landscapes, nature, places, people, all with painstaking detail. But his most famous work was a self-portrait he completed early in his career. It was worth millions and hung in a museum in London. This artist enjoyed a few years in the public spotlight, but he soon grew tired of all the attention and retreated to a remote cabin out of the public eye. For decades, no one heard from him. Maybe he was still painting, but probably he wasn't. Interest in the man himself waned, but his absence only made his works more valuable. Then, one day, the unthinkable happened. A group of vandals broke into the London Museum, shattering windows, smashing pottery, but worst of all, defacing the self-portrait that was the capstone of the artist's work. The canvas was left intact, but the portrait was covered in grotesque layers of paint. The vandals were soon caught and jailed, but their deed could not be undone. The museum brought in a team of restoration experts to fix the portrait, but no matter how much they scrubbed and repainted, they couldn't seem to match the work of the master. Even the restored painting was unfit for public display, so it sat in a basement vault. Everyone was disappointed. The work was ruined. But then, something happened that no one expected. Into the museum walked a thin, wobbly man, more than 80 years old, clutching a small box of painter's supplies. He approached the museum director. "I'm the artist," he declared, "and I'm here to restore my work." The museum director could hardly believe it, but the artist set to work immediately. He labored diligently for weeks, sometimes late into the night, but always keeping out of the public eye. Finally, after many long, painstaking hours, the restoration was finished. The museum held a ceremony to celebrate this restoration. The artist, standing before the public for the first time in over 40 years, grinned as he pulled the cloth curtain off of the painting. "This," he said, holding back his tears, "is my masterpiece." So who's the artist? The artist is Jesus. That one's easy. But who are we? I think in a very real sense, we're the vandals. This passage clearly teaches that. We defaced the image. But we're also the masterpiece. When Jesus came, we're restored, and now we get to bear the image of our Maker. Like I said, I don't think any sermon can ever do justice to a passage like this. You need a story or a poem or a song or something. You need art. I want to close by sharing a song with you that I think captures the power of this text. It's a song that helps me feel the awe that I think we need to feel when we come across something like this. The song is called Lofty by Propaganda. Stylistically, it might be a little different from stuff you've listened to before, but I want you to listen to it, and I want you to listen to the words, okay? It tells the story of creation and new creation so well. I think captures the sense of awe that we should feel. So I'm going to link that song. If you're watching this on YouTube, just look in the description. You should see a link to the song Lofty by Propaganda right there in the description for you to click on. And after you listen to that, you can move on to the internalize and respond portion of your study. All right, thank you guys, and I'll see y'all tomorrow for session 3.